On South Asia. Welcome to the podcast produced by the Department of Modern South Asian Languages and Literatures, South Asia Institute, Heidelberg. The following conversation took place in 2023 when Professor Frank J. Korom spent the summer in Heidelberg as a Humboldt awardee. He was then still teaching at Boston University. In the meantime, Professor Korom has shifted to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he is now a senior scholar at the School for Advanced Research and a research associate of the Museum of International Folk Art. Since his relocation, he is continuing his academic work in various ways.
My name is Justyna Kurowska, and today we have with us Professor Frank J. Korom. Frank is a professor of religion and anthropology at Boston University and an affiliated professor of folklore and mythology at Harvard, vice president of the American Institute of Bangladesh Studies, author of several books, documentary filmmaker, and awardee of, amongst many others, the Humboldt Research Award. You organize museum exhibitions. It's a very impressive range and variety of research. How would you describe yourself as a scholar? As Indologist, folklorist, or anthropologist?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, my doctoral degree is in folklore and folklife, which is, when I tell that to people, they often get very surprised because many people don't even know that it exists as an academic discipline. Folklore for a lot of people just means old wives' tales and so on. But really, in the 70s, it became kind of more oriented to a kind of linguistic approach. And that's when the name change occurred and it became known as folkloristics in the United States. It didn't catch on so much, the term didn't catch on so much in Europe, but in the United States there's a specific history, and it's really an interdisciplinary history, how different factors came together from a variety of different departmental interests to create this idea of folkloristics. And it's heavily grounded in sociolinguistic theory and performance theory. And the basic idea was to bring together text and context, and that's where where the intersection between oral literature and performance. So, in one sense, I'm a folklorist, but I'm also an ethnographer. But I really like to think of myself as an aerial specialist because of my interest in South Asia. And in the United States, once upon a time, having a degree, at least a master's degree in a specific region, geographic region, was considered good because then you would have all the basic building blocks to go on and do a PhD in another discipline that was more widely known, like anthropology or economics or political science. So I chose folklore, which was already interdisciplinary, but fortunately I was at an institution at a university where there was also a strong South Asian Studies center. And so I was able to develop my aerial interests there.
Would you say that knowing different South Asian languages is like essential part to research all those disciplines, to do this aerial studies or ethnology?
Yes, I think so. I think I'm not a linguistic determinist or anything like that, but I do feel that knowing the language or languages of a culture or cultures that you're studying is absolutely essential, just to help you sort of get into their worldview and understand things from their perspective rather than just having to rely on a translator or an interpreter to get the meaning of things. So for me, language is an essential tool for understanding culture and worldview. So yes, I do think that language is important, and that's one of the reasons why I immerse myself in several South Asian languages rather than focusing on one, because I wanted to know everything there was to know about South Asia, which of course is impossible, but I felt like it was one way of moving in that direction, to be known by my colleagues as a South Asianist rather than someone who works simply in India or in Pakistan or Bangladesh. And that's why I wouldn't say I'm an Indologist, because Indology has that sense of being more about the study of classical India. And I actually did study Sanskrit. On my own I did a little bit, but I never studied it formally because I was more interested in contemporary modern vernacular languages. But I also did some medieval work as well.
Right. So for the last few months, you have been hosted by the South Asia Institute at the University of Heidelberg, and especially by the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, as a recipient of the Humboldt Forschungspreis, this prestigious award given by the German government. So could you tell us what is your relation with the department, and what is your expertise in all these South Asian languages, which languages you speak, which you use for your research?
Sure. So I've known about the South Asia Institute in Heidelberg for a long time, but it was such a faraway place. Of course, me being in North America and Heidelberg being in Germany, I didn't have any direct connection with the place. But I had a number of European professors, among whom were several German professors. In fact, my Bengali professor was a man by the name of Petr Gefke, and he knew several of the faculty members here at the South Asian Institute. And so, he was always talking about how wonderful German Indology is and this and that, and speaking about the good old days when he was still here in Germany and so forth. And then we had several other people on the faculty who also were European, among whom was Wilhelm Hauptfass, a well-known German philosopher who wrote a really important book called Indien und Europa. And I was actually one of his assistants when it was being translated into English. So I really learned a lot about sort of the interactions, philosophical interactions between South Asia and Europe. So I didn't really have any direct connection with the South Asia Institute in Heidelberg until I met Hans Harder, who is the professor and chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures here at the South Asia Institute. And we became friends through his own professor, Rahul Peterdas, in Halle. And Rahul Peterdas was a friend of my professor, Petr Gefke. So it was really through, collegiality and that kind of networking that we became friends over the years. And I also then, around the same time, met Professor William Sachs in the Department of Ethnology. And of course, he's American and trained at the University of Chicago, and I was trained at the University of Pennsylvania. So he and I have very common interests as well, and we both started out studying pilgrimages, ironically, but I moved out of that area and did my doctoral dissertation on something completely different. But so that's how I came to know about Heidelberg and how I got connected with it. And of course, it was always seen in the United States as being one of the premier places in Europe for the study of South Asia. And I knew that here there was an emphasis on language just like there was at my university, the University of Pennsylvania. Although I believe Penn, if I'm not mistaken, offered several languages, instruction in several languages that are not taught here anymore. Or they may have been in the past but aren't in the present. So because all these languages were available to me, I decided not to just focus on one, but I decided to move. I originally started out studying Hindi and Urdu while I was still an undergraduate, when I was working on my bachelor's degree. Then when I went to graduate school into a PhD program at Penn, that's when I shifted into Bengali. And I did both medieval and modern Bengali because of my interests in performance. And, in medieval Bengali, there's this epic tradition that I got very interested in. So those are the three languages that I initially studied. And I lived in Pakistan for a year, where I also briefly, I studied a little bit of Punjabi, a little bit of Pashto, and so on. I just was really interested in languages and especially poetry, the Urdu ghazal and so forth. And so I was just trying, like I said earlier, just trying to learn, soak in as much as I could, because, I was just thirsting for knowledge, and language was one way of getting it. Later on, when I moved from the Hindi-Urdu heartland over into Eastern India, I also studied Uriya and Assamese, because they're closely related to Bengali as well. And then since then, I've worked on Tibetan and Tamil also.
Right, and now is your main research on Tamil, right? But we will come back to this later.
It's not really on the language itself, but it's the language that is spoken by the Muslim population of Sri Lanka. And I'm working currently on a Tamil Sufi named Guru Bawa, Muharram. And Tamil was the only language he spoke, which the Sri Lankan Tamil, which is a little bit different, I would say, than Southern is.
Right. So since we are already at it, maybe you can just say a few words about your most recent research, and which is mostly on this oral history of this one very interesting, enigmatic Tamil-speaking saint, Guru Bawa.
Yeah.
And maybe you could tell us more about the nature of this study and how it all started, and how you kind of find your interlocutors, and what are the specific challenges of researching oral history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it all kind of happened serendipitously, because when I was still an undergraduate, I was studying at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And one of my professors, Dennis McGilvray, who is a specialist on Sri Lankan Tamil matrilineal kinship, told me that, since you're going east to Philadelphia, to the University of Pennsylvania, you should look up this fellow named Bawa. And I didn't know who that was. And he said he's a Tamil Sufi from Jaffna in the northern part of the country. That was back in 1985, or 84, I guess, when I was graduating. And then I went off to Pakistan, as I mentioned, for a year, and that idea just receded into the back of my mind. So when I arrived in Philadelphia in 1985, Bawa was already on his deathbed, and he died in 1986. So I never got to meet him. But then, in 2006, fast forward several decades, I was just finishing up on a project about these Bengali scroll painters, the Potuas, and I was wondering what I should do next. And fortunately, I received a Guggenheim Fellowship, so my dean gave me some time off, and suddenly I remembered Bawa for some reason and what that Professor McGilvray had told me. And then I contacted them, and I went to Philadelphia and met some of the people on the board of trustees, and that's how it started. And after a few years, I applied for a grant to spend a year in Sri Lanka. So fortunately, it was at the time right when the Civil War ended, and so I was able to easily get a visa after I was given a grant from the American Institute of Sri Lankan Studies. So then I decided to go there and to look at that side of the story, because it's really about how Bawa was able to bridge the gap between, Sri Lanka and North America. And during the period that he was alive or active in Philadelphia between 1971 and 1986, he went back and forth from Philadelphia to Sri Lanka so that he could spend time with both of his congregations, both there and in North America. So that's what he did, and he spent about 50% of his time in Sri Lanka and 50% of his time in Philly. But when he died, he was buried in Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia. They had purchased land there to create a cemetery, and so it's on a big hill, and his mazar is on the top of the hill, looking down at all of his, what he called his children who died before him. And so, as you mentioned, he's a very enigmatic fellow, and so it was there was very little written about him, and it was all just oral tradition. It was all legends, hagiography, so on and so forth. And so, and as a folklorist, I tend to take these things seriously because a lot of historians question the fidelity of oral history. But there is a subfield, I would say. It's small and peripheral, but there are several people who write extensively or use oral materials. And after all, if you're dealing with a culture that doesn't have writing, then like most Native American cultures, for example, didn't have literacy or scripts for that matter. So you have to take oral history seriously if you're studying people who don't have a written language. In this case, Bawa himself was illiterate, or non-literate, to be more neutral. So you have to take most of the knowledge that we have of him and his life comes from just his teaching and the sermons that he would give, which they all recorded, and they have a huge archive in Philadelphia. And so because Bawa didn't speak any English, he always had these Sri Lankan Tamil interpreters translating everything simultaneously as he was speaking. So when you listen to the tapes, you hear the English, and then you hear Bawa speaking the Tamil in the background, right? Because they were trying to do it simultaneously. So the challenge, I would say, is to try and get as many versions of each narrative or event from a variety of different sources, and then see what they have in common, where they differ, and so on. Sort of like what manuscript scholars do when they do a critical edition of a text. You find every recension of it, and then you look at what they have in common, what's different, so on and so forth. Only you're doing it with oral text rather than written text. Then the issue of my interlocutors. There's really a variety of different groups involved. The Sri Lankans have a different way of thinking about it than the American disciples that he had. And the Americans have, their own particular way of thinking about Bawa, which was a little bit alien to the people back home in Sri Lanka. And so, sometimes I write about the multiple Bawas, as if, he were more than one individual, because they're so seemingly different in terms of how the Americans understood him and the way that the Sri Lankans understood him. And what I've kind of come up with is a kind of three-phase developmental theory of his career from the time he started till now, well, up until he passed away. And the first was a more sort of charismatic folk healer. That was in his earliest phase when he first arrived in Jaffna in the late 40s, early 50s. And then he moved on to be a more mystical, perennial philosopher when he was sort of cajoled into moving from Jaffna to Colombo. And the people in Colombo were more, you could say, educated but liberal Muslims who were interested in theosophy and comparative religion. So that's why I call them perennialists. They basically saw all religions as being one, and Sufism was the medium for it. So they started calling him Sheikh rather than Guru, but they continued calling him Bawa, which is just the Tamil rendering of Baba, or father. And then when he came to the United States, he started slowly introducing Islam into the mix. They built a mosque, and then they started doing prayer 5 times a day, in addition to practicing zikr, which is what Sufis do, the repetition of phrases from various sources. So the challenge really is to try and integrate all these different perspectives and to, and try and make sense out of all this multivocality that's there. And that's currently what I'm trying to do.
That's fascinating. And how is the followership now? Does he still have followers, and this family is still ongoing?
Yes, in fact, they have an organization in Philadelphia called the Bawa Mujahideen Fellowship, BMF, and they have a website. And like I said, they have two dominant locations, one in Philadelphia where the mosque is that they built and the fellowship house. They're attached to each other. And then about 48 miles away in a rural area of Pennsylvania, that's where the farm is, as they call it. It was originally conceived of as a commune where they would grow organic food and feed each other, because Bawa was very much into feeding people. Whenever he would give a sermon, a vegetarian meal would be served afterwards. And they still continue to do that every Sunday when they have their meetings, and on Friday after Juma prayers and so on. So the farm has, that's where his mazar is located. So you have within a 10-mile radius, a bunch of his children living there near the farm. And then you have the urban group living in Philadelphia within a 10-mile radius of the mosque. And so those are the two main locations. Then there's another big group in Toronto, Canada. So they're very active. They have smaller groups throughout the United States. I would say in about 40 locations. And they're probably, the high-end estimate would be about 10,000 people total. And that would include the people in Sri Lanka as well. So they continue to have their own meetings there under the name Serendip Sufi Study Circle, which is, that was incorporated in 1972 in Sri Lanka, a year after Bawa left for the United States.
Mm-hmm. Great. So that is more like oral history or orality study, but you are also very much interested in more material culture.
Yeah.
So you were also organizing, or you were part of a few museum exhibitions.
That's correct.
And you also have this book, Village of Painters, Narrative Scrolls from West Bengal, which was conceived as a catalog for this 2006-2007 exhibition. Could you tell us more about this material part of your research and about the museum practice and
Sure.
your working with museums?
Mm-hmm. Well, after I received my doctoral degree, I did a postdoctorate year at the Center for Folklife Programs and Cultural Studies at the Smithsonian Institution. And the project was really something completely different, but it was a museum environment. And I had already become interested in material culture during graduate school because, as I mentioned, the name of my department was Department of Folklore and Folk Life. And the folk life dimension of it refers to everything that's not part of the oral tradition. That's the lore part. And the life part was things like building chairs, log cabins, pottery, glass blowing, anything that was, using material, natural material to create something for practical purposes. And I really got interested in the intersection between the lore and the life aspects. So how does, the oral tradition, interact with material culture? It's well known that a lot of oral traditions are based in work, right? So like the songs that prisoners on a chain gang would sing to not only coordinate their work efforts, but, to pass the time. So it had a pragmatic dimension as well as a leisurely dimension. And, rug weavers by singing would often use that as a way of counting the knots that they use for weaving rugs. And there are hundreds of examples of this from all over the world. And in India, of course, you have a variety of these narrative scroll traditions, and they go by various terms in different parts of India. And I got interested in what is known as the Bhat tradition in Bengal early on in my career. And I thought someday I'll work on that. And that's what I ended up doing after I finished up another project in the Caribbean. So I wanted to go back to West Bengal, and that was the perfect occasion. So I started working on this project in 2001. And there is a village in Medinipur district in West Bengal called Noya. And it literally is a village of painters, and that's why I called both the book and the exhibition Village of Painters, because everyone in this one hamlet within the village of Noya had at least one member of the family who was involved in this tradition of narrative scroll painting. So basically, these are lengthy scrolls that are divided into frames, and they paint them, but then they also sing songs to accompany the unraveling of the scroll. So one verse of a song would correspond to one frame of the painting. And so that was fascinating to me, and that's how I got interested in doing an entire study. And by that time, I had already been working at a Museum of International Folk Art, as you mentioned at the beginning in your introduction. And I had been there for 5 years working on the Tibetan diaspora and an exhibition on recycling and several other things. But then when I left there in 1998 to take up this position that I'm in now at Boston University, I had this idea in the back of my mind that I would go and collaborate with them in the future on a project about the Potuas, the people who make these part scrolls that I was talking about. And so that happened. I negotiated it for several years with them, wrote up a formal proposal and a budget, and then I just started working on it, as I said, in 2001. And in 2006, we did organized the actual exhibition and brought out this book called Village of Painters, which is the catalog for the show. And I brought two of the artists over from India, one male and one female, to serve as artists in residence. And we traveled throughout the state of New Mexico, where the Museum of International Folk Art is located, doing workshops at schools and 2-year colleges, community colleges, and one even on a Native American Indian reservation. So it was really a fascinating kind of intercultural experiment. Yeah, the results were very good. The exhibition was a success, and most people seem to appreciate the book as well, which is more heavy on the visual side. And there's an essay, of course, that goes with it, and detailed captions for all of the visual imagery. But I think the material and the verbal go together very well in many cultures, and so this is just one example from India of that. So museums can be a good way of doing teaching the public what academics do, but in a more accessible way. You know what I'm saying? So a lot of people tend to think that scholars mystify certain traditions, but by doing an exhibit, it's a way of sharing it with people in a way that is comprehensible to them.
You also mentioned your work in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, and since, this is a different type of activity, but you did this documentary on the Hussein practice there.
Correct.
Do you also see it as a type of activism, or maybe not activism, but kind of showing the research to a broader audience?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so that was conceived. I mentioned I was at the Smithsonian. That was conceived that project was conceived while I was doing my doctoral research in West Bengal on the other side of the world. And in fact, just in the middle of my research there, I was there for about 16 months of field work around the time of the first Gulf War. And I suddenly got this letter sent to me, FedEx, from the Smithsonian, saying that I'd gotten this award to do this project on Muharram rituals in the Caribbean, especially focusing on Trinidad and Tobago, the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And I was just really elated about that, but I was in the middle of doing my doctoral research. So, but when I came back, I went down there with several members of the team, and in '91, and we looked around and set up the shoot and everything like that. And then we went back and actually shot the material for the film in 1992. And at the same time, I was doing ethnographic research because I wanted to write a book to accompany the film. Just like the book accompanied the exhibit that I would later do on the scroll painters, I had this idea in mind of having, this other appendage to it. Unfortunately, it would have been nice to have had a DVD right in the book so that when you purchased the book, the DVD would be there. Ethnomusicologists often do that, where when you buy their book, it has a CD in it that gives you samples of what they're writing about. But the film didn't come out until 1998, and we shot it in 1992. So it took some time, and funding was scarce. But when it finally did come out, it was shown at various film festivals around the world, including the one here in Germany in Göttingen, which is a well-known ethnographic film festival, an annual film festival there. And so I felt like that was, in one sense, yes, a way of bringing it to the public, and also exposing the community a little bit more, because it was not a very well-known fact that there were even Muslims in Trinidad, much less Shiite Muslims. And so this was quite an eye-opener even to specialists, Islamicists, and so on. Yes. And so the film was intended to be shown, we had lots of footage, but we cut it down to 56 minutes so that it could be shown as a television program. In America we have something called PBS, which is a public broadcasting network. And without the commercials and everything in it like you have on the other channels. And so they usually have that 60-minute format. So we had that in mind. And then I know a lot of my colleagues who have given me feedback on it use it in their classroom along with the book. And students appreciate that because it's hard to really, in words, encapsulate the power that these rituals have unless you get the sonic dimension of it, because there's a lot of drumming, and then also the visual dimension. They build these incredibly beautiful taziyas, these mausolea that represent the tombs of Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, who are at the center of the Karbala narrative, the Muharram narrative. And so the film documents not only the construction of the tajas, as they're called in Trinidad, but also the drum making process, how the drums are made, how they're tuned. And then there's about 10 minutes in the film of the actual 3 nights of procession, where you see, the interaction of the sonic dimension, where you have this really loud, powerful drumming, and also the parading of these lovely, multicolored, glistening, glittery tajas in procession. And they move back and forth along the western main road of the suburb of St. James from about 6 in the evening until 3:30 in the morning. So it's very exhausting, and this goes on for 3 nights. And then at the end, they symbolically bury the tajas, these structures, by immersing them in the ocean. Mm-hmm. So the two go together very nicely, because the film gives you a better sense of what I'm talking about in the book. Just like you have with the scroll painters, the singing going with the visual dimension of the showing of the scroll. The film shows how the drums interact with the material dimension of these ritualistic traditions.
Mm-hmm. And how different are those Muharram celebrations in Trinidad from those, let's say, in South Asia, in India? Is there anything specific about it?
Yeah. Well, in the book, the first half of the book kind of traces the origins and history of Muharram rituals from even, I argue, pre-Islamic times, because there are some cult of the dead-like traditions that were indigenous to the Persian plateau prior to, the advent of Islam. And then it really became, during the Safavid period, it became kind of the state ritual, focusing on what Michael Fisher calls the Karbala paradigm. And so from there, it then moved to South Asia, and then from South Asia all over the world, literally through British indentured labor practices after the abolition of slavery. So there are certain things that kind of, fell by the wayside, and then other things that are continuous all the way from its origins in the 10th century down all the way to contemporary Trinidad. And then there was one aspect of it that everyone thought was unique to the Caribbean, and they have what they call these moons, and they're shaped like half moons, and one is red and one is green, and they represent Hassan and Hussein. And when I got deeper into the research for it, this was after we had already shot the footage for the film, I discovered that these are actually used in Bihar as well, and where they're called sipar. They had a precedent already here, and then I found in 19th century images of them also in the British Library, which are in the book. And so there are a lot of continuities. One of the arguments that's often made is the attitude changes when it goes to Trinidad, that it becomes more of a carnival than, let's say, a sad observance, So is it a celebration or is it an observance? Is it praying or playing, you could say. But like the Easter Passion of Christ, it has a sad dimension to it and also a happy dimension to it, right? The sad part is when the hero dies and gets, tragically murdered and suffering in the process. To then, the joy that follows because of the sacrifice and the suffering that hero made for the world, you could say. And so that's how it's explained in Trinidad. It has a sad dimension to it, but then also a happy dimension to it. And one thing I would say that is unique to Trinidad is the way that the drums develop. Tassa drumming is not something found only in the Caribbean. Tassa is an Arabic word, so it has a long history. There are these clay kettle drums, and they're accompanied by large bass drums that they call booms, but they're like the dhaks and dhols of India, from Eastern India. So both the tassa and the bass drum have their origins in South Asia and the Near and Middle East. But what changes is the rhythms that they use. They call them hands in Trinidad. And the Jose hands, as they're called, are very distinct, and those you can trace back to India. But then after the whole celebration, after the whole ritual observance is over, when they do the janazah prayers and the tajas are considered to be dead at that point, then that's when they start celebrating. So they break into rhythms that are more oriented to what is known as soca. And soca is kind of a dance form that is used for carnival music as well. And then there's a genre called chutney soca, which is kind of immersed in Bhojpuri folk song and narrative. They call it chutney, and then the soca is from this carnivalized aspect of it. So that part is kind of a local creolized indigenous development. So everything has kind of more a continuous dimension, but then also an innovative new way that it's practiced in the new location.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. So, Frank, I would say thank you for taking us through this South Asianist, aerial specialist, folklorist journey, and thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
You've listened to an episode of on South Asia, a podcast by the Department of Modern South Asian Languages and Literatures, South Asia Institute, Heidelberg. Have a look at our other episodes as well. For topic wishes and feedback, don't hesitate to reach out. You can find our email in the description.